Hello, welcome to my course on AP Computer Science. In this course, we're going to study object-oriented programming using the Java programming language. We will be writing our code in the BlueJ interactive development environment. So if you haven't already, please download the BlueJ environment. I've created a new project called Bakery. What I'd like to start with today is making some classes. So let's click on a new class. And I'd like you to call this class Cookie. Make sure that your class name is a capital letter. All of your classes should have capital letters to start with. Very important style. All right, once we've made it, BlueJ is going to populate this with some pre-made code. But I always like to start fresh. So I'll just hit Control A and delete it all. Okay, so let's talk about what a class is. A class is the basic file structure in Java, but it's also the building blocks for objects. A class is a lot like a cookie cutter. You take a cookie cutter and you cut out different cookies out of the dough. The cookie cutter itself is not a cookie. It's what makes the cookie, right? So that's why I'm starting with my first example being about a cookie. So our cookie class is going to be a cookie maker. So let's start with class cookie. Now some of you may be familiar with access modifiers such as public and private, and we'll get to those in just a second. But for now, I just want to start with that. All the code in a class needs to be inside curly braces, which are located just above the quote symbol and the enter key. Now, every object has what are called states and behaviors. The states are the characteristics that describe the object. What kind of features this makes this cookie unique? So what I want you to do is I want you to picture in your mind a cookie. What is it that we could do to describe, to differentiate that cookie from some other cookie? Well, the cookie I'm thinking of has a certain radius. Okay, it's circular with a certain radius. Now, the radius could be 1 inch, 2 inch, or more likely something in between the two, like 2.7 inches, 2.3 inches maybe, or maybe in centimeters, 5.7 centimeters. So we highly doubt that the cookie will be a whole number radius. So we should store the cookie's radius in a data type called a double. The double allows us to store both whole numbers and fractional parts called real numbers. So I'm going to declare that my cookie will have a radius. I'm simply declaring that here, and I end the line with a semicolon. I also think that this cookie should have a type, because I want like chocolate chip or peanut butter. So I am going to make it a type, and my type will be a word. Words are stored in what are called a string. You'll notice that the string variable type, or maybe we could call that ingredients, the string variables are a capital S, whereas the double was a lowercase d. And that's because a double is just a number. It's a primitive. It is not an object. We are making a class so that we can make objects, but this class also has objects for data types. So a little confusing there, but hopefully it'll make sense as we go on. Okay, so what else about my cookie? Well, I think this cookie might have nuts in it. Some people like walnuts in their cookies, and some people are allergic to nuts, and they really need to know that. But it's either going to be true or false that this cookie has nuts in it. So the variable type that stores true or false in Java is called a Boolean. So that will be a Boolean has nuts. Remember, Java is a strongly typed language, so every different variable that we give our cookie has to have a type. You'll hear people talk about don't forget to type your variables. You need to consider what information that variable will hold and then tell Java what that will be. So I want to hold real numbers in my radius variable. So when I create the variable, I tell Java it's a double. I want to hold words like chocolate chip or peanut butter or white chocolate macadamia nut. I want to have all that stored in a type, a variable called type, and so that's why it is a string variable. And then finally, whether or not it has nuts is true or false, so that'll be a Boolean. Okay, let's go ahead now and let's make a constructor. Constructors are used to formulate your cookie. The way you write a constructor is you simply put the name of the class again, but this time you put parentheses behind it, and I'll simply open and close those parentheses. Then inside the curly braces, I will be able to initialize the variables that we declared here. These are called instance variables. You'll also hear them called fields. The constructor will initialize. It will initialize. They initialize the fields. So, by the way, these slashes here, which is the same button as a question mark on my keyboard, they make a comment. So this stuff here is just me commenting so that you understand what I'm doing. This is completely ignored by the computer and by Java when we run our code, though. Okay, so what radius should we make our cookie? Well, I think 3.7. And I don't know if that's inches or centimeters. We should probably say radius in centimeters or something like that. Okay, but for now this is fine. What type of cookie? Well, how about just chocolate chip? Okay. And has nuts? Well, no, not today. Not feeling like it today. So I'm going to make that false. And we'll hit compile. Okay, so when we hit compile, what happens is our code is converted down to something more readable by the Java machine. It is converted into what's called bytecode. So originally compiled languages were compiled down to what's called machine code, which is just zeros and ones that the computer's processor can understand. Java kind of does something close to that. Java makes what's called a virtual machine, and that virtual machine reads bytecode, which is closer to machine code than this code here, but not quite the same. Okay, so let's go ahead and make some cookies. The process of making a cookie is called instantiating the class. When we instantiate the class, we get an object. So every object is called an instance of that class. It's that class at that instant. So in the BlueJ environment, right-click on your cookie class and select New Cookie. And cookie 1 is fine. You can call the name of your instance anything you want. My cookie, cookie 2, or anything at all. But it's nice to have variable names that make sense. So cookie 1 is good. All right. Now, if we double-click on our cookie, we should see the information about it. You could see that it had a radius, it had a type, and it doesn't have nuts, just like we said. So objects can actually hold lots of information. Remember, our radius could only hold one number, but the cookie itself was able to hold a radius, a type, and whether or not it has nuts. So classes allow us to make variables that hold lots of information. Okay, well, the only problem is if I make another cookie, guess what? It's exactly the same. Every single cookie is going to have the same size, same type, and the same whether or not it has nuts. So that's kind of boring, right? Well, I tell you what, let's make it to where we can make different kinds of cookies. And the way we do that is by changing the constructor. So this would be what we call a default constructor. A default constructor is one that is got no information inside these parentheses. Let's make another cookie constructor. This time I'm going to allow the user of my class, when they instantiate my class to make a cookie, I'm going to allow them to send us what are called arguments. And those arguments will describe the kind of cookie that they want. So let's say double. Now I want to use a word here that's similar to the radius variable, since that's what it will be setting, but not exactly the same. You can do that, but it's kind of yucky. So I'll just use the letter R for now. And then I'll say string T. And I'll say Boolean, let's just say nuts, like that. Okay? Now, this is a little confusing on the vocabulary, so let's take it slow. The user, when they instantiate our class, will send us arguments. Those arguments go into each one of these variables here, which are called parameters. So when you write a constructor, the variables that you put here inside the parentheses are called your parameters. But when they're used by the user, they're called arguments. A lot of people just call them parameters or arguments all the time and mix up the two, but that's the difference. So these variables here, R, T, and nuts, will only exist as parameters for this constructor, and they only exist between these two curly braces that I have just highlighted. So this little yellow block here, this is the only place where R, T, and nuts exist. If I try and access them outside, like this, I'm going to get an error, like identifier expected, because it's going to say, I don't know what T is. It's asking what type it is. It doesn't know because T doesn't exist outside of that constructor. In order for us to take what the user gives us here and make it permanent, we have to store it into the variables that we declared at the top of the class. So the assignment in Java moves from right to left and uses the assignment operator. So I will put, when I say radius equals R, we read that as radius gets R, or R is assigned into radius. Then type gets T, and has nuts gets nuts. Now I've made a constructor that allows me to make a custom cookie. Let's see how that works. When you right-click on the cookie class now, you'll notice that we have two options at the top. We have our cookie that has no parameters, and we have our cookie constructor that has 3. Let's click on the one that has no parameters again, and you can see that we still have our default cookie that we made. Now let's make another cookie, this time using our second constructor. And I'm going to make this cookie have a radius of 5.3, and I'm going to make this one white chocolate macadamia nut. Now, because it is white chocolate macadamia nut, I need to go ahead and say true for the has nuts. Notice that the word true and false are special words. They don't have quotes around them, but anytime I enter in other kinds of words, they need to have quotes around them. Okay, let's double click on this cookie and we'll see what it does. Okay, that's super awesome. So as you can see, you can make a class that will allow us to store lots of pieces of information. Here we're storing 3 pieces of information, but we could store a lot more. Also, when you store information, the information you store can be a simple piece of information that is stored in what's called a primitive, or it can be more complex information itself that is an object like string. We said earlier that objects have states and behaviors. The states are those characteristics that describe it, that are set by the instance variables. Here, the radius, the type, and whether or not it has nuts. But what about behaviors? Objects can do things. So let's write some behaviors. To make a behavior is called a method. We've actually already made a couple of methods. They're special methods called constructors. These special methods have to have the same name as the class, and they do not have what's called a return type. All other methods in Java must have a return type. So whether or not your method will return something is determined by that first word, and if it does return it, you have to say what it will be. Will it be an int? Will it be a double? Will it be another type of object? Let's start with a method that doesn't return anything. A method that doesn't return anything is called void. So this void method is going to simply print to the console something about the cookie. So I'm going to call this print cookie. So maybe this will give a description of the cookie. Notice that every method has to have these parentheses after it, right? The parentheses are what the parentheses can hold parameters, or they cannot. This one here, we're not having any parameters. And we'll just simply say system.out.print line. So we have an option here to make a print to the console. When printing to the console, it's system, capital S, then out, and you can either say .print or .print line. And I'm going to print this, and I'll put a space after it, then plus, and I'm going to put my type here. So it'll say this chocolate chip, white chocolate macadamia, whatever we make it, and then I'll put cookie is, now I'm going to put the radius, and I don't know what we decided that units was, but I'll say it's centimeters. There we go. So now what we have is a description of the cookie. All right? And when we call that method, it will print it. Okay. Oh, something not right. Oh, I'm missing my parentheses to end my print statement. Well, I could do that. There we go. So when we call print, we put in parentheses everything we want to print. All the words have to be in quotes, and the variables do not. Okay? All right, now let's try compiling again. Super. All right, let's make another cookie. We'll start with our default cookie. And we can inspect our cookie, and we can see these different characteristics. But now we have something else we can do. If you right-click on the cookie, you'll notice we have some other things we can do. We have print cookie. It's void. That means I don't expect to get anything back. Let's click it. You'll notice my console, what they're calling my terminal window, appeared, and it says this chocolate chip cookie is 3.37 centimeters in radius. So that's what a method can do. It can make things happen for you. If you right-click on the cookie object, you'll notice there's actually some other methods that we have here as well. These are methods that are inherited by every object. So every object in Java actually gets some methods automatically. We'll talk about some of those later. Anyway, let's make another cookie. How about this cookie be really big, 10.7, and I'm going to make this one peanut butter. And it's true that peanut butter cookies have nuts in them, even if they're ground up, I guess. All right. So I can double click on it to inspect it. But now I also can print a cookie, and there it is. Pretty neat, huh? Okay, so now we've seen how to write a method. We've seen how to write a method that does not return something. And that's why that method is void, because we did not return anything. Now let's look at how I would write a method that would return something. Well, we've got our cookie's radius, but sure would be nice if we could figure out what our cookie's diameter is, right? So think back to geometry class. The diameter of a circle is just twice the radius. So let's write a method that will return to us the diameter of our cookie whenever we so want it. So we need to think, well, if we're going to return it, so we're not printing it. We certainly could print it, but instead we're going to return it. What kind of number would that be? Well, our radius is a double. A double meaning it's a real number with a whole number and a decimal portion. So if I double that, I'm most likely still going to have those decimals, right? So when you multiply a number times a double type in Java, you also get a double. So that's what we'll be returning. So double. And let's say that we're going to call this get, because I'm getting something, right? Get diameter. And again, I don't need any parameters in this method because I'm not sending it any arguments. Okay, so in order to return, you simply say return. And I'm doubling the radius. And while it makes sense that doubling a number that has a whole number and a fractional part will typically still have that fractional part, it's also important to realize that the rules of Java would require this, that if we multiply 2, which is called an int, because it's an integer, times radius, which in this case is a double, Java will automatically make the results of type double. So if we were to say this was an int, we would actually get an error because that's not going to work. It's going to say possible lossy conversion. It's warning us. It's saying, hey, what if you multiply something like 3.7 times 2? That's not a whole number. So it's warning us. So we want to go and change this to double. Okay. Let's try it out. I'll compile. And I'll just make a default cookie again. And we can print our cookie like we did earlier. But now we have the option to get diameter. And you'll notice our method result window comes up and says it returned this number. And so that's a really important difference. When you print something to the console, that's it. You're done with it. We can't just go into the console very easily and grab stuff off of it. But with returning something, I can then use this in something else. So sometimes we just print things. Sometimes we show them up in a window or make a pop-up window. Those kind of things are void. Other things are not void because we return them to the user so they can use them somewhere else. All right, one other thing I want to look at before we close out this lesson is we've seen how to make default constructors. We've seen how to make constructors that take parameters. Let's see how to make a method that takes a parameter. So I'm going to change this class just, well, no, I'm just going to add something here. Let's say, what if we wanted to change our cookies size? So I'm going to call this a void method, and I'm going to make it to where the cookie gets larger. So I'm going to call it enlarge. So this would be making your cookie bigger. All right. And I want to give it a factor. And we'll make the factor an int, because I don't think we've seen that yet. So whole number types are of type int, short for integer. And this is kind of a silly method. I can't imagine ever really doing this in real life. You don't just take a cookie and make it bigger, but it's a good example, I guess. All right, so what this is going to do is take our radius and it's going to make it bigger. So I'm going to say radius is equal to, or radius gets, radius times factor. And there's lots of ways that you can actually shorten this. We could have said radius times equals factor. So I'm going to make that note, radius times equals factor. So that's another way to multiply. You simply do times equals, we'll take the radius, multiply it by a factor, and make that the new radius value. But this is what it does. It takes radius, multiplies it by factor, and then stores it back in the radius. It's void because I'm not returning anything. All right, super. Let's take a look and try this out. All right, I'm going to make my default cookie again. All right, there it is, 3.7 chocolate chip and false. Okay, now I've got several methods. You know, I can get the diameter, I can print my cookie. Let's enlarge it. Let's triple in size. Now let's look at it. Look at that, quite a bit bigger. Notice that this last number seems to be a little bit off here. We'll talk about that more later, but doubles are not accurate in their last little decimal place of precision, so usually we have to round them. But rounded, this is accurate. 11.1 is definitely 3.7 times 3. And let's print it again so we can see that when we enlarge the cookie that it will now look different. Where's my console over here? Perfect. Okay, so in this lesson, we learned how to write our first class, make a constructor without parameters, make a constructor with parameters. We learned how to make a method that's void, that prints to the console, make a method that returns something, and make a method that takes a parameter. Just one more time, I want to show that in large. This here, when I type it in as an argument, notice I'm saying cookie1.enlarge, and the factor that I put in there is the value that's going to go, that 2 is going to go right in here in factor. And that's how that works. And you can see I've made it even bigger now. All right, until our next lesson, take care.